Hello, welcome back to my channel. Making this video because I watched another video. It was a conversation between Charlie Kirk and Michael Knowles, and it's interesting. They usually discuss other topics, but in this case, I know that they're both Christians, and Michael Knowles is a very devout Catholic, and they were just having a little dialogue. And I'm making this video because Charlie Kirk brought up some points and I don't feel comfortable with the way that Michael Knowles really didn't respond to them. And so I'm going to make this video as my response to Charlie Kirk's um, objections, questions, and I'll put the link down below so you can go on to it. I I know that there's a way that I can put it on the screen and I can show it. I haven't figured that out yet. This purpose of this channel is for something else, but this is something that interests me, and so I'm putting it on here. And I'm curious to see your thoughts. I'm also going to be answering some other videos, but that'll be in subsequent videos. Anyway, the first thing that was brought up that I thought was very interesting was Charlie Kirk's opposition to the papacy. And he said this, he referred to the Pope Francis as a Marxist. Um, and I know that among conservative traditionalist Catholic circles, we're not fans of Pope Francis. He does espouse some liberation theology, which is Marxist. Um, Good natured, of course. It's the term social justice is part of that. And the idea, of course, and I got this great quote from Saint Bernard de Clairvaux. Essentially, is I know that I don't know in French, but in English it would be the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And in liberation theology, there are some good ideas, but there's talks about assistance for the poor, but it brings up some ideas like redistribution of wealth and essentially Marxism. The there are communities in the church that work very well, but they're small communities. Where everyone shares everything else. When some of these ideas have been tried out in the past, they've always been disastrous. The ones that come to mind right away are when the Pilgrims came, they set up a system kind of like this before Marx, of course, and where they were going to share everything, and it all fell apart. But Charlie Kirk's objection was specifically as to the purpose of the Pope, and if the Pope is the representative of Christ on earth, that's the worst possible representative. This guy that the Pope that he mentioned some things about his views on homosexuality, and he seems very open to them. And Michael Knowles pointed out correctly that that God does not bless sin, and so there he kind of like dodged the bullet there. But here's the better answer, and it's this: it's that the Pope and Charlie Kirk brought this up that the last time that he asked when was the last time the Pope ever made a declaration, and Michael Knowles says it was 150 years ago. I believe that it was when the doctrine of infallibility was brought up at the same time that it was that the Assumption was declared uh, doctrine by the Church. I think it was Pius the Ninth that did it. And he says, so what's the point of having a pope? And well, we've had fantastic popes and we've had awful popes. Sometimes popes that are heretical and they're referred to as anti-popes. And the idea is, of course, that um, the Pope is the rock, the chair of Peter is the rock that the church was founded on. It was Christ, but then there's the famous verse Matthew 16, 18, I believe. I can't remember what the name of the verse is. I used to know them perfectly well, but now I don't. But it's Matthew 16, 18, I believe. Upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will never. Anyway, the that's the idea. And so Charlie Kirk has an objection to that. It's like, if my pastor was bad, I'd go to another church, right? I'd choose another pastor. And that seems like a very good quick fix. But in the evangelical world, if you keep doing that, everyone just decides. Then eventually, you won't have a church any longer, or you'll keep dividing them until forever. And one of the challenges that evangelicals have is that different evangelical churches have different beliefs, and sometimes they're at odds with each other, and sometimes they're very big deals. And so having the Pope continuously since Peter has held the church together, even though sometimes they've been awful. It's held the church together. You know, John Paul II was a fantastic pope. They canonized him, and they now some of them, and I call him John Paul the Great. Um, but in the past, we've had weakly popes, we've had awful popes, we've had corrupt popes. But as long as that chair was filled and he did not contradict doctrine, the church has persevered. There's a quote, and I know that Charlie Kirk brought up a quote by Hilaire Belloc. I bring up a quote by G.K. Chesterton, and the quote, it goes something along the lines of, the Catholic Church has died many times, but it survives because it has a God who knows his way out of the grave. There were times when there were two popes, in France and in Italy, and the church survived. And the church survived when they reestablished that chair, when it went back. And so that keeps it going. The next objection he had, and so yeah, we may have a pope that not all of us are crazy about, and he's okay on some things, but generally I'm not a big fan, and he's one of these progressives, and progressivism is just a disaster. But like I said, it keeps going. So as opposed to changing pastors, and then all of a sudden you have divisions in the church, and then it falls apart, and that's what the evangelical churches struggle with. The next point was the Bible, because one of the things that Charlie Kirk brought up, and I believe that was in the discussion about Mariology and the true presence in the Eucharist, transubstantiation. And Charlie Kirk also brought up, why listen to a pope? You've got the Bible. And then of course Charlie Kirk brought up, Michael Knowles brought up, yeah, well, how did you get the Bible? The canon of the Bible was established. And then, of course, Charlie Kirk brings up, well, there's 66 books in the Bible. There's the Old Testament, the New Testament. And he says, why do you guys not have the same Bible that the Jews have? And we have the exact mirror image of the I think it's 39 books. In the Old Testament, we have the exact mirror image. They're exactly the same. And Michael didn't give a good answer to that, but here's the answer. The answer is that we did not use the canon that the Jews did, because the Jews rejected Christ. Okay? And when the early Christians, which a lot of them were Jews, they used the Septuagint. And the Septuagint had the 7 extra books, and then the other readings that are sometimes, I think, in Susanna, the story of Susanna and Beth and the Dragon, 1 and 2 Maccabees, and so on. And the problem that Charlie has is that the canon of the Hebrew Old Testament, the Tanakh, the division of the Torah, the writings, and the prophets, I believe those are what they were, weren't determined until after Christ. They weren't determined until the year 100 or so. I used to understand that there was a story about Jamnia, and that after the temple fell apart, that they all kind of regrouped. The Jews did, the rabbis, the Sadducees, and the Pharisees, and they kind of like said, these Christians are, adding books, that they believe are inspired, and they're in kernel form, the Gospels and so on, the teachings. And so they're like, well, we need to have, definitively what the Bible is. And so as a counter to those that were using the Septuagint, they said, well, we're not going to use any book that was not written originally in Hebrew. And so that knocked out those 7 books. And some of those 7 books supported Christ. And so that's why they didn't use them. Mariology, I'm not very, very good on, and I struggle with Mariology. So I will leave that at the end, and I may not even address it very much. But one of the challenges that evangelicals have is Bible, listen, scripture, sola scriptura, Bible only, okay? There was a large time in the church when there was no Bible. in the first several centuries. And beyond that, until the printing press, Bibles were scarce, handwritten, people couldn't read and write. And so there was a Bible that had been canonized, and it was canonized at the councils. There was the Council of Rome, Carthage, and Hippo. That's where they were debated, and they determined, okay, these are the books. And they did it as a response to heretical books and other heresies, the Gnostics, the Manichaeans that were running around claiming things. And there was a ton of writings. There was the Gospel of the Hebrews. There was the Proto-Evangelium of St. James. There are all these other books, and they were being used sometimes. And so when the church was finally allowed to practice and the council started to get together, they said, we're going to get together and we're going to hammer these out and they're going to say what they are. And it was, I know that Origen used the Hebrew, but most of the church used, and they considered inspired, the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament. And like I said, part of it was because they, supported Christ being who he said he was. And so for the longest time, that's what was used. The challenge that Charlie Kirk has is that if if you're using the Bible, what did the early Christians do when there was no Bible? And this is the phrase that kind of like explains it all. We don't believe it because it's in the Bible. It's in the Bible because we've always believed it. He made a reference that, I know why you don't use why you guys have these books is because they support Catholic doctrine. They believe there are references to purgatory that were in there. And he says, and you don't want, that's why you guys kind of like, he was suggesting that we kind of like, illegitimately brought these books in after the fact. That's why we brought them in. And they were not considered canonical by the Jews. No, they weren't, but we don't go by the Jews who rejected Christ. So, that's not a reason to have only those Hebrew books. And anyway, the last item, or maybe second to last item that I'll be bringing up is transubstantiation, which is the true presence of Christ in the Eucharist. Well, the argument is this. If you were to go into a time machine and there's, and Charlie's a really smart guy. So, maybe the Pope being who he is a deterrent and he's happy where he is, and that's great. But here's the problem with believing that communion, which they don't celebrate every week at evangelical churches. The reason that we do not believe that it is symbolic is that in the early church, in all the writings, there's unanimity in the true presence that Christ is present in the bread and wine after consecration. All of them believed it. Some of them were called heretics in the early church. They were called heretics because some of them would reject it or question it. And then there was also questions on the divinity and the natures of God and so on, of Christ and so on. But few that would reject it were considered heretics. And on top of that, there are early historians, Josephus, and there was a very famous Roman historian. But in the early records of the Christians, not by the Christians, but of the Christians, there is in the historical record, there is record that the early Christians were accused of cannibalism because they would celebrate the Eucharist and they believed that they were consuming the body and blood of Christ. And that was believed forever, even up until Luther. It was believed. He called it transubstantiation, and he had his own explanation of what was going on. So for all that time, it was pretty much standard. Everyone believed in the true presence, and it was it was central to the faith, and it's still central to the faith. So that's the answer to transubstantiation. One of the things that's a lot of people notice, or this comes up, is the Holy Mass that we celebrate every single day. We're obliged to go on Sundays, but we celebrate every single day, is the same Mass all over the world. And it's two parts: the Liturgy of the Word, where there are readings from the Bible, and the Liturgy of the Eucharist, which is the reenactment of the Last Supper. And at every single Mass, the reenactment of the Last Supper is, people go and they see it and they kind of like, no, okay, well, this is, those that still accept the true presence or know about the true presence. But even some of those that do will go and, okay, well, this is what's happening. I understand that. But so much more is happening. Of course, it's the reenactment of the Last Supper. It's when Christ celebrated Passover with the apostles, and there are 4 cups. Each cup symbolizes something different, something significant. The last cup in the Bible, Jesus says at one point, "Save me from this cup," because Christ is the last cup. And that buttresses what he did, and he's saying, do this in memory of me. Eat my body, and eat my body and eat my flesh and drink my blood. And so there's a context that's all involved, but that's kind of like where it is, and it's very hard to argue against it. I'm a big history person. I know that Charlie is too. If you were to read the early readings of the early writings of the church, it's not very evangelical. It's pretty Catholic. Okay, and that's fine. There are people that haven't. I struggle with my faith, but I've come to believe certain things, and I know certain history, and so I've come to accept things even if I don't understand them. And evangelicals are in a place where, and Charlie said this, we believe 9 out of 10 things, and we have 9 out of 10 things in common. And that 10th thing is the thing that separates us. And, I wish that it didn't, but it does. But I would challenge evangelicals that, and to his credit, Michael Knowles did bring this up, although it didn't really have the impact that I thought it should, is in the Catholic Church is the fullness of the faith, including transubstantiation, include the Marian doctrines. The Marian doctrines, which like I said, I don't have a relationship with Mary. I wish that I did, but I understand that the Marian doctrines also support the divinity of Christ and the Trinity. That's and so they're important to understand. And it's a lot of people go to Mary, and the phrase in Catholic Church is to Jesus through Mary. Sometimes maybe Jesus may seem distant since you pray to Mary. I have some challenges of my own, and I'll discuss them in the next video. But in a nutshell, that's my response to Charlie Kirk. Anyway, thank you for visiting my channel. And if you have any comments on what I just said, please write them down at the bottom. Give me a thumbs up and subscribe to keep my channel going and to get at some point, become. I'm trying to, start multiple streams of income. This may be something that gets monetized. So I'd appreciate your support. And I will put that link for the discussion between Charlie and Michael below. And thank you for watching.